Well, good morning. Good morning. Good to see you this morning. We're glad that you're here today to worship with us, to spend time singing our praises to the Lord, offering our prayers to Him, acknowledging Him in our offerings, and bringing together the life of the church. It's delightful to be here with you this morning. It's the first Sunday of June of 2018, and as Deb's uncle used to say, forgot about my first million. I'm going to start it on my second. Abandoned my first million, started on my second. So we're going to start something new this morning, something different. You will notice there is no title in the bulletin, and no one knows. Well, there's one person that knows, but she's not talking of what it is that we're going to be looking at starting this morning. And so I'm hoping that you'll be able to figure it out through my introduction this morning. Okay. I want to tell you some of the reasons why I'm choosing the book I'm about to choose to preach through. First, I want to return to the Older Testament. Now, I had a friend recently that I've respected a great deal who calls it that, the Older Testament, rather than the Old Testament, because it gives a better flavor to the idea that the first part of this Bible that we have is not an old and unimportant section of our Bible. No, it's simply older. And so it is just as important as the newer part of the Bible. So I want to return to the Older Testament. I have been preaching from the New Testament nearly nonstop for the last 3.5 years. Going all the way back to 2015. I've been working through Romans and Ephesians during that time. And so I've been working almost exclusively from the New, which is not inconsistent, by the way. Most of my pulpit work down through the years has been from the New Testament. If you look at my website, you will notice that the vast majority of my sermons are taken from the New Testament. And I do most of my work from the Older Testament in Bible studies and Sunday school classes and that sort of thing. So that has been consistent. But I want to go back to the Old Testament, the Older Testament, sorry, and to take a book from there. Now, that narrows it down, doesn't it? I just dropped it from 66 to 39, didn't I? Okay. By the way, that is also consistent with some of my favorite expositors down through time that preach almost exclusively from the New. Secondly, I want to change from a didactic work to a narrative work. A didactic work is a work that is specifically material designed to be teaching or instructive, books that are designed to educate in matters of theology, doctrine, or practice, and to do so in the faith directly. That's a didactic book. Romans and Ephesians are clearly didactic works. The authors of those books were intentionally teaching theology and doctrine. I want to go back to a narrative. I want to go to a narrative because I think sometimes narratives are harder to preach, actually, than didactic material, because trying to find theology from a narrative can be difficult at times. Now, I believe utterly that all biblical material is didactic. Okay? Every book of the Bible is instructive. Every book of the Bible has an instructive value to it. The problem is that in narratives it's a bit more difficult. You have to actually glean it out of the book. You have to figure out what it is that this narrative is trying to teach. So while the epistles, like Ephesians and Romans, directly teach doctrines, narratives will teach doctrine more indirectly. You have to analyze the material to discover what those timeless truths are that are visible in the storyline. But, and this is where the challenge comes in, you have to be very careful as you're doing so not to take timeless truths that are not really there, which is a habit of some who preach from narratives. I've often said, don't build your theology from narratives. Build your theology from the didactic sections of the Bible and use the narratives to help support what the didactic sections clearly teach. In other words, if you believe something, if you believe a particular doctrine, you should be able to ask yourself, is that explicitly taught in one of the didactic books of the Bible? In one of the epistles, for example, of the New Testament. If it's a belief that you have entirely on the basis of something in a story somewhere, you probably have gotten it wrong. Now, not necessarily. There are timeless truths in narratives that may not necessarily be covered directly in didactic material, but the vast majority is. So that's the challenge of preaching a narrative. When you preach a narrative, you have to look through the text and you have to say, there are timeless truths here, but we need to be careful that we build those on top of teachings that are coming out of those passages of the Bible that are designed specifically for that purpose. There are some faith traditions around us today that have built their theology almost exclusively from narratives, and they get themselves into trouble when they do that. So I want to return to the Older Testament. I want to return to a narrative book, so I've narrowed it down a little more. I also want to preach a shorter work. Now, when I say shorter, I mean shorter in the sense that it can be completed faster, okay? The fact is that I would like to do this time for the Kaleo students a book that I can complete in the entirety of their time here, rather than starting it and then you come back the next year and I finish the last sermon. Okay? So I don't want to do that like I did last year. Okay? I want to preach something that we can complete here in just one summer. Now, the number of chapters in this particular book is actually longer or greater than the number of chapters in Ephesians. But because it's a narrative, you can actually work through it faster. You can take bigger blocks at a time. If you're working through Ephesians, there's a verse, for example, that has a tremendous amount of detail in it, and it takes multiple weeks to cover. Whereas in a narrative, you take a bigger block of that text, and you work through that particular block. And so you can move through the book quicker. Okay? Fourthly, I've made a choice to preach a book that I've never preached before in a church. Now, I've taught this book before in Bible Study Fellowship in the 1990s, but this will be the first time through it from the pulpit. I've not actually preached through this book before. Now, it is my custom through time to preach new works for me, because my ultimate goal is to preach the whole counsel of God. So I would like to preach all 66 books of the Bible before I die. It ain't going to happen. But, hey, you know, you got to have a goal in life, right? And I'm not just going to repeat works that I'm comfortable with. In other words, I'm not going to just go back to Romans every time or to Ephesians or whatever and preach it again because I'm comfortable with it. That would not be challenging for me, and it certainly wouldn't be challenging for you as well. So I want to preach something that I've not preached before. And I'm going to try to avoid preaching through books that Jeff or John preached through when they were here preaching. I had a recent idea and then realized that Jeff had recently preached on it just a few years ago, and so I moved away from that. Fifthly, I've made also a choice to preach a book that is fairly obscure. Fairly obscure. I have never heard a sermon series from this particular book. I went looking this week through some of my favorite preachers, and I have not seen a sermon series. I couldn't find a sermon series through it by any of those favorite preachers. I have seen some works done related to the book. Piper did an interesting work with this book, but he didn't preach through it. So I want to do this book because it's obscure. And because it's obscure, it will have some value, I think, to us. Have you guessed yet? You getting close? This one will help. I've challenged myself to preach a work that has a unique character amongst the Old Testament writings. A very unique character. The challenge of this particular book has to do with its uniquely Jewish nature. Now you'd say, well, aren't all of the books of the Old Testament Jewish? This one has a very Jewish nature to it. It has somewhat of a vindictive nature in it, and it also has a relative silence on the nature and actions of God. There's a sense in which this particular book has a strangely Jewish perspective to it, unlike many of the other works in the Old Testament. And you'll see that as we move forward even this morning. In fact, Luther himself criticized this particular book, didn't believe it belonged in the Christian canon because he saw the book as too aggressively Jewish with no gospel content. He argued that this was a book with no gospel content at all. Now, he was wrong, I think. The book had long been received by the Jewish people, of course, as a part of their canon from the very earliest times. In fact, Jesus' own words in Matthew 23, where he speaks of the canon as including the blood of the prophets from Abel to Zechariah, that's a chronological examination, by the way, would have included this particular work by definition. So, this is a book that belongs in the canon because it was accepted by the time of Jesus. I think Luther's argument was with content rather than with its location. So the challenge of this particular book will be to demonstrate its value, the value of its content, to a 21st century audience. Does this book really have anything to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ? Luther would say no. I would say absolutely. Are you there yet? Figured it out? So one more. I've also challenged myself to address the heretical idea from Andy Stanley and others that Christ followers need to unhitch, his word, unhitch their view of God from the Old Testament. Andy Stanley preached a sermon just less than a month ago in which he preached this particular idea. He said, to be relevant to our times, I'm not quoting him here, I'm summarizing, to be relevant to our times, we need to unhitch our worldview from the Old Testament and embrace the uniquely New Testament faith. The argument that Mr. Stanley is making is that the worldview that's established in the Old Testament is different from the worldview of the New Testament. The worldview of the New Testament is so entirely different that it's not even based upon the scriptures of the Old Testament. It's based entirely upon the simple fact that Jesus rose from the dead. His argument is, yes, the Old Testament's valuable, yes, it's inspired work, but just as the apostles did in Acts 15, when they decided that Gentile believers didn't need to be connected to the Jewish customs, we don't need to be connected to the worldview established in the Old Testament. Now, he's gotten a little grief from that, of course, as he rightly should. Because here's a man who is arguing that the worldview of law needs to be replaced with a worldview of love. But I would argue that Mr. Stanley, if he were to actually preach through the book I'm about to preach through, would discover that his entire presupposition is wrong. Because the worldview of the Old Testament is entirely in sync with that of the New. Insofar as that, this particular book demonstrates a view of God that is completely consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So much so, in fact, that without this view of God, the gospel itself is meaningless. In fact, I think what Andy's trying to do is say, listen, we don't want to live under that Old Testament way of thinking. We want to live under the New Testament idea of love. But here's the problem. Love is superseded by something greater in the very character of God himself. And this is a book, I believe, that demonstrates that perfectly. So the book that I'm going to preach through then, we'll see how many of you get it. It's the book of Esther. How many of you got that? By show of hands, how many figured it out? Very good, very good, excellent, very good. Here's what I want to do this morning. The purpose of an introduction sermon, of course, is to establish a sense of what we will be discovering as we travel through this book. We must start with a context. Because, as one famous preacher once said, a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. So what we want to do this morning is make sure we know what this book is really about. So if you'll find the book of Esther in your Bible, it's on page 490, we will begin working through it. I want to establish for you the context of this book. Where does it sit in the history of Israel? And what is its particular purpose? And then what is its particular value? Esther begins with verses that specifically outline where and when it occurred. Verse 1 of chapter 1. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, etc. It sits, as you can see, in the ancient empire of Persia. The ancient empire of Persia. The people who now live in modern Iran. Modern Iran is the state today of Persia, former empire of Persia. It's in the news, I think, because I think that there are a number of people in Iran who want to return to a Persian empire, who want to bring back the ancient Persian Empire. The first verses describe the extent of this kingdom. Notice it says it's from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. If you look at a map of the ancient Persian Empire, you will see that it started from the Indus River in the east, which is in the center of modern Pakistan, moving to the west through the entire Middle East, including Iraq and Palestine, to the Mediterranean, going above the Mediterranean through Asia Minor, and below the Mediterranean into Egypt and to Ethiopia. Notice the reference from India to Ethiopia. This is a major world empire that exists in this particular day. Now, let me remind you the fact that the Persian Empire is the 5th major empire to dominate the Middle East. The 5th. Okay? Do you know what they are? The first is the Egyptian Empire. We're not exactly sure when it began, sometime around 2000, maybe even earlier than that, in the days of Abraham. When he entered into Canaan around 2000 BC, the Egyptian Empire was the dominant empire of the world. We have lots of things, if you go to modern Egypt and you look, there are lots of things there built during that empire that are still standing. It lasted to about 1000 BC. And then there's an empire that many in secular world don't want to talk about, but there's an empire that's nestled in there. It's called the Solomonic Empire. Solomon was handed the rule of the Middle East by his father David, who had conquered all of Canaan, and Solomon extended Canaan and the borders of his nation across a wide swath of the Middle East. Solomon actually ruled over an empire. There were other queens, for example, coming from the south to visit him in his rule as an emperor. It didn't last very long, only about 100 years, from about 1000 until about 900, roughly, give or take. Following the Solomonic Empire was what we call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. There was a smaller empire known as the Assyrian Empire, but this is the Neo-Assyrian Empire that arose around 900 BC. It came from the east, of Israel. It lasted till about 612. This is the empire that captured the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. So another great empire arose after the Solomonic Empire collapsed. The Neo-Assyrians came and they captured the northern kingdom. Now, of course, in our study of history of Israel, of course, we know that God intended for that, to rise up an empire, to sweep through and take the northern kingdom into captivity because of their failure to worship him properly. That he intended for that. The Assyrians were replaced by the 4th empire, and that's the Babylonian Empire, which arose roughly 612 BC and lasted till about 539. The Babylonian Empire, of course, again coming from the east, captures the southern kingdom of Judah under the great king Nebuchadnezzar. So the Babylonians arose, overthrew the Assyrians, and they captured the southern kingdom about 150 years later after the northern kingdom had collapsed. They were, however, conquered and overthrown by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. He established a throne there in Susa, the citadel. It's known here in this in Esther 1. He issued his great edict, do you remember? It said that any captured people could return to their homeland if they so desired to do so. And you remember that about 50,000 Jews who were in Babylonian captivity went back to Jerusalem. They built a wall. They built a temple first, and then they built a wall around the city. So those are the 5 great empires that existed up to this particular point. Now that, of course, will be followed by the Greeks, who will eventually come, and the Romans, who will eventually come as well. But for the moment, we're in the midst of the Babylonian Empire. This book takes place during the days of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus ruled over this empire from 486 to 464. Now, his real name, by the way, is Xerxes the First. Okay, he's known as Xerxes. So once in a while I'll call him Xerxes, so don't get that confused, all right? Just to mess you up, keep you awake, okay? Ahasuerus is Xerxes the First. The book, you see, begins in the 3rd year of his reign. See verse 3? In the 3rd year of his reign. So we can date the book of Esther very clearly. We have archaeological records which tell us when Xerxes the First was on the throne. We know him exactly when he ruled because he's a more modern empire than some of the older ones. So we can date him very well. This book begins, therefore, in 483 BC. So we can date this event to a very specific time frame in world history. According to chapter 2, verse 16 and following, Esther is crowned the queen of Persia. The wife becomes the wife of Xerxes the First in the 7th year of his reign. That would put that in 479. But the major event of the book occurs in the 12th year of his reign, as you go to 37. Which puts it into 474. Now, I say all of that to you for this reason. I want you to notice something here. The first 3 chapters of this book take 11 of those 12 years to complete. The remaining chapters, the remaining 7, last 1 year. So whoever wrote this book focused 11 years into 3 chapters of it, quickly compressed all of that into one section, and then expanded out the major event of the book to last the final 7 chapters of the book. Okay? So keep that in mind as we're working our way through the book. As I mentioned a moment ago, the book focuses on the capital of Susa in chapter 1, verse 2. This particular city is located just north of the northern tip of the Persian Gulf. So it's really about 100 miles north of the Persian Gulf. If you look at some good maps, will actually tell you how the Persian Gulf extended back or north because of the silting effect of the Tigris and the Euphrates that flow into it. It was much longer than it is today, at least 100, maybe 200 miles longer than it is today. So Susa was actually very close to the coast of the Persian Gulf in its day. Today, it's quite a ways away, of course, because of the silting of the river. Both Daniel and Nehemiah lived in the city of Susa at one point in their life. So Esther, Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar all lived in this city at one time. So it's in the Persian Empire. It's in the days of Xerxes the First, Ahasuerus. But here's where I really want you to notice. It's in the time of the continuing exile of the Jews in Persia. All right, here's where I really need you to concentrate, okay? Because I want you to notice where this book sits in the history of Israel. Where does this book belong? Now, you'll notice in your Bible, if you turn back just a page, you'll notice the previous book here is Nehemiah, and the book immediately before that is Ezra, correct? Okay. Esther actually belongs before Ezra in your Bible. It should actually be in front of Ezra if we're going to do this chronologically. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by this. You remember that after Cyrus the Great issued his great edict in 538, that about 50,000 Jews returned to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel to begin the process of rebuilding the city. And they went there and built the temple. Now, notice the date, 538. If you're taking notes, what day did I say this book begins? 483. Okay, so you're looking at a significant amount of time, at least 50 years prior to these events, that group went back. I'm sorry, 50 years after these events, that this group went back, right? Wait a minute. Before. Thank you. Before. BC has always got me messed up because it's reversed, right? It's like working with negative numbers. The first wave of Jews with Zerubbabel resettled Jerusalem in 538, according to Ezra 1-6. There's another wave of Jews then that go with Ezra, and they arrive in 458 under Artaxerxes, which is the king after Xerxes the First. This is noted in Ezra 7-10. Nehemiah then arrives in 445. All right, so the timeline is Cyrus in 539, Esther in 474, Ezra in 458, and then Nehemiah later than that. So you'll notice where Esther belongs. It sits right in this space between the Edict of Cyrus and the coming of Ezra. But it sits after the first few chapters of the book of Ezra. So if we were going to do this right, we would stick Ezra right after about the sixth chapter of Ezra. Would be where it belongs. So it's in this time frame in which the Jews have been taken off to captivity, but now they're starting to return to Canaan, Palestine, right? It's in this particular time frame. So we could say that the events of Ezra and Nehemiah occur after the events of Esther. But we can also say that the events of Ezra and Nehemiah occur in parallel to the events of Esther. So there's like two time tracks running here. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe events that are taking place amongst the Jews in Jerusalem and Palestine after the 70 years of exile are over. Remember, it was predicted they would be in exile for 70 years, and then they would return. And it is 70 years to the year that they begin the process of rebuilding the temple. And so there's a sense in which all of these Jews from the southern kingdom, they're called Jews, by the way, because they come from Judah. Okay, so they go back, they're carted off to Babylon. There they are in Babylon for 70 years. Cyrus the Great comes along, issues his edict, says you can go away. And they do. They go back, some go back. 50,000. But millions stay in Babylon. Millions don't go home. They stay there. Now, why would they do that? Well, it's just human nature. It's what we do. We get comfortable where we are. We set down roots. I mean, they've been there for 70 years. That's at least a generation or two, right? So you got to have a couple of generations of Jews, some born there, many born there. In fact, probably more born there than not. So there they are in Babylon. They've established businesses. They've built homes. They've mingled with the natives that are there, including a lot of other conquered peoples that the Babylonians had taken captive. So here they are in Persia now, and they're comfortable. 50,000 decide to take a risk, go back to Jerusalem, but the rest stay. So what this book is, really, is a glimpse into the life of those Jews that stayed behind. Ezra and Nehemiah spend a great deal of time talking about what happened to the Jews that go back to Jerusalem. But this little book gives us a glimpse into what happens in the lives of those that stayed behind, that remained back in Babylon. Esther describes events taking place amongst the greater number of Jews that do not return to their homeland and are not a part of the redemptive historical story. Where does the Christ come from? Does it come from the Jews that remain in Babylon? No, he does not. He descends from those 50,000 who go back to Jerusalem, who rebuild the temple, who rebuild the wall, who rebuild a nation, if you will, and he descends from them. So this is a group of diaspora Jews who do not, in fact, belong to the redemptive historical story, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why Luther looked at this book and says it has nothing to do with the gospel. Because the people we're talking about have nothing to do with the eventual coming of the Christ. But, now I'll finish that but in a minute. We do not know, of course, who wrote this book. Much like much of the Old Testament, it is utterly anonymous, right? We have no idea who wrote this book. No one really knows. There are a number of hints, however, in the book itself that it may have been written by one of its main characters, a supporting actor in the story known as Mordecai. Now, I would argue, if I were an arguing man, and I am, that this book should actually be called the Book of Mordecai rather than the Book of Esther. Esther is not, in fact, the main character of the book. She appears to be, by virtue of the fact that she becomes sort of the linchpin around which things happen, and we'll see that as we go through the story. But Mordecai is much more important in how all of this flows. Now, I know I just sound like some sort of sexist pig, throwing Esther out of the story and putting a man in it. I know. So maybe that's the reason why, we ought not to do that. But the fact is that Mordecai, who was, as we will discover in the book, Esther's cousin and guardian, is probably, or very possibly, I prefer the word probably the actual author of this book. And there's a number of reasons why I believe that, and this is consistent with what a number of scholars have suggested as well in regards to the book. The author, whoever he is, had a first-hand familiarity with the events themselves. There's a lot of detail in this book of things that, really got to be involved in the story to know. Names, for example, of people, of individuals who show up in the book along the way. A sense in which this writer knew the events, and he knew the customs, and he knew the sense, the feeling, if you will, of what was going on at the time. Now, who best fits that but Mordecai himself? Secondly, the author, whoever it was, had access to written materials that are actually used in the storyline. There's actually materials written outside of the story itself that are included in the text. There's some examples in 2:23, 3:12, and following 6:1 and 8:8. In other words, there's a number of places where various edicts and other kinds of things are actually included by the writer. Who would best have access to that stuff? A guy who was living the story and who himself was a part of, even in some cases, the authorship of those materials. And then thirdly, and I think this is the most significant one to me, why I believe Mordecai wrote it, the author had a keen sense that the events of the book were critical to Jewish history. Now notice I didn't say redemptive history. I said Jewish history. The writer had a feeling that this was important to the very survival of the Jews themselves, of course. And writing from his perspective, he wrote it in that sense. And who most would have that sense of a keen feeling? The guy who was living it. And the guy who was in the middle of it, right? So there's plenty of evidences in this text that it was written by someone very familiar with the events themselves, who had access to the written materials, and who had a very keen and, dare I say, personal sense of what was going on in relation to the Jewish people. Now, if you flip very quickly to the very last chapter, this is one of those very strange places where the chapter breaks in this book are really bizarre. Chapter 10 really doesn't belong, in the sense that there really shouldn't be a chapter break here at all. It should just be included in chapter 9. But at the very end of the book, there's a postscript given. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. If Mordecai wrote it, he had no sense of humility in regards to himself. I was important, people. When I went through this stuff, man, I was second to the king himself. And when he imposed tax, it's because I was hot, you know? Some have suggested, by the way, that little postscript on the end negates Mordecai as the possible author, but if you read that more closely and carefully, it seems as though the writer here, if it is Mordecai, is saying, yes, I was important, and the various things that happened, they're written off in another book called the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia and Media, and I was great amongst the people. But, notice the last sentence, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to his people. If I'm Mordecai writing this, I'm saying, listen, I want you to understand, I didn't go through all this to be important. I went through all this to save somebody. It's not about me, in fact. It's about them and their survival. So I don't buy the argument that this little verse suffix at the end negates the possibility of Mordecai having written the book. In fact, I think it strengthens it to me. Mordecai's writing why he wrote the book. What is it speaking to? What's its point? What is he trying to tell the world? Or whoever he wrote it to. Okay? So his role, I think, is simply to say, look, I helped my people to survive. Now, there's a very simple outline to the book of Esther. It's not hard to outline this book at all. The first two chapters we would call the rise of Esther. Chapters 1 and 2, the rise of Esther. Chapters 3 through 8, the salvation of the Jews. And then chapters 9 and 10, the revenge of the Jews. So there's three sections. Esther rises to her role as queen. The salvation of the Jews through her rise to queen. And then finally, the revenge of the Jews. So the first couple of chapters have some interesting things in it. There's the downfall of Queen Vashti, the rise of Esther to the queen, and the foiling of a plot against the king by Mordecai. What you see here is the rise of Esther to a place of prominence. So she becomes important in a place of prominence. But then, as you move to chapter 3, the real fun of the story begins. The plot of Haman to destroy the Jews, Mordecai and Esther work to save their people, the reversal of fortune against Haman, Esther winning the right for the Jews to defend themselves. It links itself back to the first two chapters in the sense that the value of Esther's prominence now appears. Why was she raised to her position? Answer, in order to accomplish a work. To be there. To be there. And then the last two chapters, and again, Luther really disliked the last two chapters of the book because the Jews set out to destroy their enemies. They set out to destroy their enemies who had come against them, which he didn't like particularly. By the way, Luther did have some anti-Semitic thoughts. A lot of his writings are anti-Semitic, so you've got to kind of be careful with Luther when you read him. The other thing that Luther didn't like about chapters 9 and 10 is the establishment of a feast, the Feast of Purim, which is not an official Jewish feast. It's not in the law, right? It's established amongst the people who were not a part of the redemptive story at all, And so therefore it doesn't flow down from the Mosaic law into the natural life of the people of Israel. Rather, it's a feast established by a group of Jews living off in Babylon who were disobedient to the call of God to come back. And yet that feast has now become normal amongst the Jews. They celebrate it. In fact, I read one commentator point out that it's one of the most festive of all of the feasts of Israel. Luther had a problem with that. I don't. And I think there's some reasons why, and we'll discover them, I hope, when we get to chapters 9 and 10. So the book is easy. The rise of Esther, the salvation of the Jews, the revenge of the Jews. Now, what is the purpose of this book? What is the purpose of it? Even if Mordecai didn't write, someone else did. Why was it written? What's the intention of this little book? I would say the intention is this: the history of events celebrated by the Jews in the Feast of Purim. In the very simplest sense, this is simply a book written to explain why that particular feast exists. In the very simplest sense, it's here is why this particular feast was inaugurated. Or if we want to be a little more melodramatic, we could say it's the work of two faithful Jews to prevent the genocide of the Jewish people in the days of the Persian Empire, and the feast that reminds of it. So it's just a longer way of saying the same thing. The real purpose of this is what this particular feast is all about, why it exists, why it's on the calendar, etc. Now, I want you to note there's a parallel here in this particular feast, Purim, versus Hanukkah, which again is another feast, you will remember, that was not established in the law, but rather established later. Hanukkah was established during the Maccabean Revolt, during the intertestamental period. A festival celebrating, again, the survival of the Jewish people. So Hanukkah and Purim have a similar start in that they both are celebrating the fact that the Jewish people survived an existential threat. Now, if you look at the Maccabean Revolt, you may say, well, it really wasn't an existential threat. I mean, the Jews weren't a threat of being extinguished, but their religion was. And you simply cannot disconnect the Jews from their religion, can you? If you get rid of their religion, are they still Jews? Well, ethnically they may be, but their religion is ultimately what establishes them what they are, because it came from the beginning of their very existence. So I would argue that the parallel between Hanukkah and Esther is that both feasts are dealing with the fact that the Jews had certain existential threats. And I would remind you of this. From the very beginning of their existence, sinister forces have been at work in this world attempting to eliminate this people from the earth. From the very beginning of their existence. I mean, I can rewind back to the first chapters of the book of Exodus, right? When Pharaoh issued his decree to do what? Kill all the male children of the Hebrew people. What was his intention? Terminate them. If you eliminate all the male children, how many more generations are there going to be? There's always been sinister forces in place. I mean, we could look at the 20th century, right? I mean, the 20th century alone. How many attempts have there been to eliminate this people from the face of the earth? So Esther simply falls into the same category. It reminds us of the fact that another event takes place when the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were nearly annihilated by evil forces. Yet, again, they survive this attempted genocide and come out even stronger. So Esther might not be in the direct redemptive historical line coming out of Jerusalem. It might be a whole bunch of Jews living over here in Babylon away from their home. But the fact is, that's been consistent with the Jews for a very long time. Of all the peoples of the earth, of all the various ethnic groups living on this planet, which one, other than this people, has been dispersed so radically for so long? None. All other ethnic groups have lived in their ethnic hometown, in their home areas. They might have been dispersed. Some have, but not to the extent of this particular people, which has always fascinated me, by the way, because it's one of those internal evidences that there's something unique about this people. There's something different about these people. And the difference is that they keep getting dispersed, they keep falling under the threat of annihilation, and somehow it never happens. So if the purpose of this book is simply to tell us what Purim is all about, what's the value of the book then to us? Aha. Now hopefully your ears are perked up. Here's the unique challenge of the book of Esther. It never mentions God. Not one time. There's no one in this book that prays to God. There's no one in this book that refers to the Word of God. There's no worship of God ever in this book anywhere. There's nothing in this book related to Jehovah. He's not pictured anywhere. He's not written anywhere in the book. There's no recording of his name anywhere. By the way, again, this is another reason Luther said, get rid of it. There's no mention of God in the book. He struggled with that. He argued because there's no explicit reference to God, he believed the book has nothing to say to the propagation of redemptive history. But I would argue there's a tremendous amount of inferred involvement on the part of God. He may not be spoken of directly, but he is spoken of implicitly in the book. Esther is a massive tome on the issue of coincidence. Esther is a massive tome on the issue of coincidence. The seeming alignment, quote unquote, of two different events that bear on a single matter. You ever had one of those situations where two things come together and you go, wow, those two things, they're completely different, and yet somehow they work into this particular moment? Ever had a coincidence? Of course you have. We all know what it means. Co-incidence. An incidence that's co-established with another. There's a number of them in the book. The downfall of Vashti herself as queen and the rise of Esther to replace her. Mordecai accidentally hearing of a plot to kill the king. The king having insomnia on the night before Mordecai's execution and reading the very words of his exaltedness from some time earlier. Coincidence? And the writer includes specific things in the book that the participants could only have inferred their reliance on God. Mordecai may not come directly out and say, God put you on the throne. But he said something awfully close to it in chapter 4, verse 14. In fact, that's the key verse of the entirety of the book. Chapter 4 and verse 14. For if you keep, this is Mordecai speaking to Esther now, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. He may not have said, listen, if you don't help us, God's going to send someone from another place. But he clearly infers it, doesn't he? And he doesn't say, well, you know, you kind of coincidentally come to the throne here, and that's a great help to us. No. But he could have said, it is God who put you here. You see it? The book itself may never use the name of God. It may not speak specifically on the name of God. But there are a number of ways through the course of this book where it'll be so obvious that God's hand is behind the scenes that it would be foolish not to mention it. The writer didn't, but I will. So here's what I think the value of the book is. This book is a treatise on the sovereignty of God over everything and how he providentially orchestrates all things within his sovereignty to the outcome he desires. This is a book, undoubtedly to me, and I hope to you by the time we're done, a treatise on the very sovereignty of God, that God is in fact sovereign, ruling over everything in his creation, and as a part of that sovereignty, acting providentially in time and space to make events occur to accomplish what he has sovereignly purposed to accomplish. God ruling over everything that takes place in this planet and actively, albeit invisibly, working behind the scenes to move the world to the outcome he desires, even down to individual events that occur in the lives of people. You see, as Reformed believers, we recognize the sovereignty of God as central to the gospel, do we not? We believe the sovereignty of God is essential to the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not some plan B that happened to be successful because Jesus went to a cross, because Pilate decided to kill him. That's not the gospel. That's not the message of hope that we have. The message of hope that we have is that God purposed even before the foundation of the world, knowing that man would fall into sin, to send his Son into the world to accomplish the redemption of human beings. And the fact of the matter is that God providentially ordered every single event from the moment he said, "Let there be light," to the moment that Christ died on that cross, so that that Christ would in fact die on that cross. Untold quadrillions of decisions made by human beings and everything else in the world lined up all the way from the point of "let there be light" to a cross. That's the sovereignty of God. And this book is simply a tome on that reality. We recognize the sovereignty of God. Secondly, as Reformed believers, we deny the existence of coincidence in favor of providence. We don't believe that things are coincidences. Oh, that just accidentally happened. Ha ha! That's good luck for me. No. I mean, we often use that kind of language, unfortunately. But what we believe as Reformed believers is that God is providentially working. And when those kinds of circumstances appear to line up, and I would argue they always line up, your entire life is a coincidence. When they appear to line up, it isn't a coincidence. It's the providence of God. It is God working in time and space to accomplish his will, even if he's using secondary and tertiary means to accomplish it. And as Reformed believers, we assume that redemptive history is a sovereign work of providence, as I said. So here's the application of this book. Here's what it's going to say to us as we go. This is a biblical example of how God is at work in your life, even when you don't see his hand working directly. This is going to be a book which is going to remind you again and again and again and again that God is at work in your life, but you are not aware of most of it. You see, the fact is that the majority of our existence, in the majority of our existence, we have little direct consciousness of the activities of God around us, right? Wouldn't it be fair to say that you have absolutely no idea of how many times over the course of this past week the Lord God prevented you from being killed? You ever thought about that? About the fact that there were probably a number of times when you could have slipped and fallen and be dead, but God providentially prevented that from occurring. But you don't know it because it didn't happen that way from your perspective. You see, you don't have the omniscience of the Lord to look and see all of how things went in your life over the course of this week, do you? I mean, most of us can't even remember what we had for lunch yesterday, And the fact of the matter is that you can't look back over the last 168 hours of your life and say, oh, I see here and here and here and here. We are oblivious most of the time to what's really going on around us. Most of the time, we just don't even notice it. We don't live in the moment. I mean, people say they do, but we don't. We live in a haze where we don't really see most of what's going on in our lives. But here's a book which is going to remind us again and again and again and again that God is at work in our existence, accomplishing His goals, His purposes, His intentions from moment to moment, day by day, in every outcome of everything, either good or bad. Ouch. Yeah. All the good stuff, we'd love to say, yeah, God was doing that. All the bad stuff, no, that wasn't God. Wrong. Everything, good or bad, evil or good, that comes into your existence is ordained by this God, and He's superintending all of the events of your existence to accomplish His purposes. Because according to someone in Scripture, it says that He predestined us to be conformed to the image of His Son. And another place, that same writer said something about the fact that we have been established by grace through faith for works He prepared beforehand for us to do. Not in the moment, beforehand. God is not reacting to your life. God's not going, oh, sorry, Perry, I'll try to fix that for you now. No. God's going, Perry, this is what you're about to go through. And I've ordained it for you. And it's for your good and for my glory. You are going to hate it for the next few hours. But I don't care. Because it's good for you. Now multiply that by 1 billion. And you get an idea of just one day of your life. This is a book that's going to remind us that this God may not be visible to us all the time, but He is there behind the scenes at work, which means, hopefully, ironically, that what should happen as we finish the book is you're more aware of how God is working in your life. That you're thinking more about the fact that God is at work in your life. Whether we accomplish that goal or not, we shall see. But the fact is that this is a book, I think, which is consistent, very consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, because it's a book which reminds us that our God is so big, that He can rule over all of the events of this world. And when it's all said and done, whether it be your life or the life of a nation or the life of a planet, when it's all said and done, it comes out exactly the way He wants. Here's a people who survive because God works it out through a set of circumstances. And here's a church through whom God is going to work it out exactly as He intends. So I'm looking forward to this little narrative. It's also a classic piece of literature. This is one of those books that has a plot. It has irony. It has comedy. It should be fun. And maybe we'll get it done before you guys go back to Kansas and Missouri.